I thought before I go to church, I tape this little thing in commenting on the Q source. And many people, probably for a lot of people, this would be the first time you've heard of a Q source. Yeah, it was only recently that I've heard of a Q source, and now the Muslims, as we saw in the earlier clip, is using it against us Christians, and rightly so, because where did that come from? It comes from the German theological school, and it's been promoted by our own people. There was in the 70s and 80s, there's this group of people called Jesus Seminar, and there was this big conference where they brought together all the scholars, all the Jesus scholars, and everybody would come up with books and sayings written, supposedly that Jesus said. So that would be included in the four Gospels and the Gospel of Thomas and anything that you can find floating around in the world today. And they would look at every single saying of Jesus and say, is this authentic? Put a red mark if we think that Jesus said it, and so on. And out of this seminar came a lot of books, of course, as usual. People, especially if you're a part of a university faculty, you have to write books. And there was this book written by Burton Mack, I think, criticizing the origins of Mark. And I try to understand why Mark. It's a common belief that Mark was the first gospel to be written. It's short, and supposedly the other gospels copied him and used his framework and added their own. So really and truly, the other gospels would rise and fall with Mark's gospel. If Mark is good, then the others are good. If Mark is bad, then so possibly that's the understanding why Mark was criticized, and say, so the criticism is that Mark couldn't have written what he wrote, and that he had another source that he learned from. What other source? Oh, okay, let's call it Q. Why Q? It's the German school. Q. The word for source in German starts with a Q, so they conveniently call it a Q source. But nobody has ever seen a Q source. It's just a hypothesis that Mark copied from Q. I could come up with like an A source too, right? And if I tell a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. I think this is my projection after reading all these things about a Q source. So this Muslim is saying that nobody knows who wrote the Gospels, that they had another source, a Q source, there was a Q Gospels and Q Gospel, there were Q Christians, and this is the Q source. But nobody has ever been able to find a fragment of any Q document or any mention in the Gospels. And over the next few sessions, I will continue to talk about the Gospels, its authenticity, that we can trust every single one of them, that this is nonsense, is a hypothesis that they've thrown out. And every generation, there are Jesus scholars who come up with more and more preposterous ideas, and that was what came out of that seminar. And we shouldn't be surprised that more and more, as we progress more and more in this life, that other scholars, so-called, would come up with other preposterous hypotheses too. And we know a few currently floating around. So it's important that we know our scriptures. See, just a simple reading of the Gospels. So in church, we read excerpts from it and we don't see the whole narrative and understand how it's all put together. We must, in order to do this work, well, as Christians too, even if we're not debating Muslims or other religions, we must know our own scriptures. And therefore, not just defend it, but for our own peace of mind. Because when this was brought up during the live stream, I criticized it. I said, Q never existed. It's a myth. And somebody said, well, maybe there is a Q document. It's like, it's preposterous. Okay, we cannot allow this to continue. We must go to Mark, read the Gospels, read all of them, read the biographies, and see, did they or did they not write this? I believe totally in it that they did. And supposedly they don't, a lot of scholars, so-called, doesn't think that these four people, or at least Mark, would be able to come up with what they came up with. They must have help. It's like, why would you think that? We're using our 21st century mind to project it on this first century life. It doesn't work. It will not fit our narrative. We must go back into that time and read it from there. And I believe in totally the authenticity of Mark, and therefore of all the Gospels, and therefore of all the books in the New Testament. And I assure you, we can be sure of that. Please, I implore you, read the Gospels from beginning to end. Thank you.